Hello and welcome. This video is going to talk about Fantasy Showdown. These can be found on websites exactly that of DraftKings. There may be other ones that do it of the like, but I'll be using their format in talking about such. I'm going to be talking about, in particular, that of the game between the AFC and NFC, the All Star game or Pro Bowl that will be played on Sunday afternoon. Going over the introduction, let's go through the six big keynotes that I think is worth talking about as far as really the basic information to know and play in these games. Number one, must play one player as a captain, and it is the player you think will get the most fantasy points upon all participants within that game. For almost every single time you need to win, you need to have the best player. There's no other way around that. And then after that, you're going to have five other players. So who are the next five best going to be? That's generally what you want to do. Entries in this, it's like poker tournaments on steroids, with massive entry size games and five-figure fields and payouts that are very similar. 40,000 player games. The Super Bowl is six figures, like 1/3 people in the $3 game. I'm going to have at least 2 to 3 lineups in that card. But I'll talk that this is the All-Star weekend. So thus, let's talk about this game. My best advice in showdowns with large fields is to give yourself the most realistic shot of winning with no one sharing your card, thus having a unique lineup. For if you go with a lineup that is commonly owned, you could end up getting first place and winning literally a very small fraction of what first place would pay. Because you're going to get maybe 2% of first place, 2% of second place, and 2% of every field prize up down to 50 if 49 other people share your lineup. There are interesting strategies to do so. The first one is to ensure that you have players that are hardly owned. Get somebody no one is going to get. Then after that, it really shouldn't matter too much. Or have a couple people barely own just to do what you can to be unique. And another one is to take dollars or not use your payroll and have a very cheap price roster. If you're allowed 50,000 to allocate towards your team and price, instead of spending about 50,000, if you spend around 43 or 44 or 45, and then that should make it so that probably nobody is going to have the same lineup as you. They have to be thinking the exact same way as you would, and then have the exact same, of course, like the bingo card, if you will, the exact same combination, so you'll have the same score. What's very important is to understand the nature of the box scores you are playing, how the point system is going to work out for the top scorers and everybody below that. We're going to take a look at the last 8 box scores, fantasy-wise, on the in this video. The rake, it's very high, but it's still profitable long term. It's getting around 20%. It is extremely high, but that means you have to be very, very good. And playing games like this, when you're looking to win 1000x, 500, anything of large x proportions, then if you can adequately give yourself the best lineup you can that is going to have unique information, then that's going to work. And the late information, that can be big, especially with the NBA. If you find out something late, like earlier this week, there was so much for late information that would come out of players coming in and out of lineups at the last minute. And you find that, you can then take advantage of such. Now let's take a look at the Pro Bowl. There are 5 different general positions of players you can play. And when you think about how a Pro Bowl game is played, and I've watched probably maybe too many of them over my life, but they're pretty cool to watch. At the quarterback, each team has 3 of them, and it's going to be very, very, very hard for them to accumulate points. If they have a really, really good game, 140 yards, 2 touchdowns, 1 interceptions. That's about 12 and a half fantasy points. That's good, but it's not that great. Running backs. Well, several backs are on each team in what is a passing league. Runners should have very little success with under 10 carries, even under 6 and 7 for most of them. And then little chances to catch the ball. So even if they get 3 or 4 catches, a lot of them are small check down passes, and you're not going to get as many of those in the All-Star game, especially with rules where you can't blitz the quarterback like you can in the regular season. And I'll talk more about it on the defense numbers, but it's not too hard for quarterbacks to have time in the pocket and throw the ball. Wide receivers and tight ends. Each team has 2 tight ends, and there's more wide receivers. In the regular season, these positions with 1 point on DraftKings point per reception are the top dogs in the business for the best point totals in a top game level. But running backs and quarterbacks can have monster games as well, especially when a running back can get over 20 carries and catch a lot of balls. And when a quarterback can run the ball or start throwing for over 300, 400 yards and 4 or 5 touchdowns, they start to get monster points as well. But in the All-Star game, again, the running backs and quarterbacks aren't going to do it. Getting 100 yards receiving in an All-Star game is not out of reach. And having 2 catches for 100 yards and a touchdown, you get 2 points for the catch, you get 10 for the yards, that's 12. Then you get 6 for the touchdown for 18. Then you get 3 for the 100-yard bonus for 21. Wide receivers do seem to be very, very live, and they are in these games. The defense. Points allowed may hurt. It used to historically always be 47-40 type All-Star games. But ever since the Jerry Rice versus Michael Irvin, I think it was, or Deion Sanders, or when they had, for 3 or 4 years, they drafted players back and forth. It wasn't AFC versus NFC. Games have been more lower scoring. Last year it was 24-23. But interceptions are very live. After all, for defenders, oftentimes they don't want to play very tight coverage amongst the defense. Go for the big tackles and everything. And one reason in the regular season they don't go for aggressive interceptions is because it's too risky of a play where if they miss, the receiver's going to go for a touchdown. But because it's not going to be as physically contacted of a sport, defensive backs are going to go more aggressively after them, and they're the best defensive backs in the business. And one reason Peyton Manning threw a lot of interceptions in his career was because he had an amazing spiral. So it's going to be the same case with top quarterbacks in the game. Well, Mitch Trubisky had a good year, I guess, for Chicago. But okay, well, sacks can be high as well. A lot of it is the quarterbacks just falling on the ground and letting the defensive backs touch them when they know they're not going to be able to get rid of it. But the sack counts as a sack. And touchdowns for defensive backs, they go up. So they're definitely live to play, but it's still difficult for them to get monster amounts of points, especially when it's going to be difficult to allow like under 14 points. For a kicker, if they can get 5 field goals and an extra point, that's about 20, 21, 22 points depending on where the kicks come from. But it's really hard to imagine that they're going to do well enough to be worth it on the fantasy. So let's take a look at statistically over the last 8 Pro Bowls. Who had the best game fantasy and who were the next 5, because I calculated such. And last year, Delaney Walker had 2 touchdowns and 19.9 fantasy points. Then the NFC defense had 16 points. Again, they are very playable. So you needed Walker as your captain. Kyle Rudolph, tight end, got 14 fantasy points. T.Y. Hilton, wide receiver, gets about 14. Graham Gano, a kicker, gets 13. You're not going to see many kickers on this list, but there was one last year. Jarvis Landry at 12.8. The year before that, wide receiver Doug Baldwin got about 16, and below that was Odell Beckham, Travis Kelce, NFC defense, 2 in a row, Delaney Walker, and Dez Bryant. I really do believe that picking a defense is like a coin flip, unless you really want to go deep into how good some of the defensive backs really are. But both defensive backs are good. Either one can be good. Sometimes you might want to use two exact lineups where, if say you were fortunate enough to think, yeah, I want Baldwin, Beckham, Kelsey, Bryant, and Walker, and I'm going to have the NFC defense on one lineup and the AFC defense on the other. Well, you would have won this one, and whichever the AFC defense would have had would still have had a good amount of points to cash something. Year before that, Travis Kelsey, a tight end, had the best day. Alvin Robinson or Allen Robinson, wide receiver, 21. Russell Wilson, quarterback. You're not seeing many on this list. Have we seen a running back yet? No, this is the third time we've seen Delaney Walker. He's not playing this year, so his streak will come to an end. We're seeing Jarvis Landry on this again. I think he's playing again this game. Definitely somebody I'm going to be targeting. And DeAndre Hopkins at 16. So the receivers getting on this list. The tight ends, year before that, Emmanuel Sanders with 24. Then tight end Greg Olsen. We have a quarterback at 19 and 2/3 at Matthew Stafford. Darren Sproles, a little over 18. A lot of these for catches, though. Antonio Brown and Odell Beckham, receivers. Do we get the grasp of who we play and who we don't play, or who I'm playing? Year before that, Josh Gordon got 18 points. Then running back DeMarco Murray. Not often they get on there. There was one. Jimmy Graham at 16.1. Deshaun Jackson at 13. And then both defenses, the Rice and the Sanders defense. Again, this is when they started the lower scoring games. Let's go to the year before that. AJ Green with 39.9 fantasy points. Just fantastic. Wide receiver. Vincent Jackson, 27, wide receiver. Kyle Rudolph, 26, tight end. Victor Cruz, wide receiver, 26 almost. Larry Fitzgerald, about 18, wide receiver. And then quarterback Andrew Luck. Year before that. Wow. Brandon Marshall got over 50. Wide receiver. Larry Fitzgerald, receiver, 38. Steve Smith, receiver, 26. Now let's do the tight ends. Tony Gonzalez, Jimmy Graham, and Antonio Gates. Do we see who I like, who I want in my lineup for positions? And finally, the year before that. The final score was 55-41 of this game. The NFC defense got 21 fantasy points. They got 2 touchdowns. I think the AFC defense only got 1. Back then, there was kick returns. There's no kickoffs anymore in All-Star games, so you can throw that part aside. But with the great high-scoring points, were the offense in this game, it was really spread out. Reggie Wayne with 19.6, Jamal Charles 15.2, Adrian Peterson 14, running back, David Akers 14, Alex Mack, and if you're a football fan, you're like, who's Alex Mack? And if you're a diehard football fan, or a Cleveland Browns diehard football fan, you're like, how did he get on that list? He's an offensive lineman. He's a center. Yeah, that's a center. He wasn't available to play. But technically speaking, and I'll let you try to figure out how this is possible, his stat line for the game was 0 catches for 67 yards and a touchdown. Huh? Yeah, 0 catches, which is 0 points. 67 yards, that's 6.7. And 6 points for a touchdown. And it was one of those plays where you lateral back and forth. And I guess the rules work that whoever the last person is to carry the ball on a catch gets the yards, the complete amount, and the touchdown if applicable. And whoever catches the ball gets the catch, I guess. But that was the stat line. I looked at 2 different sources for it. They both had the same thing, 0 for 67 and 1. But I find that interesting how it got like David Akers, the kicker, gets 14, but Jamal Charles, only one receiver at 19.6 on this one game. It can happen in football games where quarterbacks will really spread it out. And if there wasn't the same different quarterbacks every time, they would have the game. So statistically, amongst those 8 games, a wide receiver has had the best score 5 times, a tight end twice, and a defense another. A wide receiver has placed, finishing 2nd to 6th on 16 occasions, a tight end 10 times, a quarterback 3 times, a running back 4, and then 2 in the last 7, because 2 was the last year. A defense has done it 4 times, a kicker twice, and then that center. Therefore, when playing these lines, these games, the strategy, and giving myself the most realistic shot at winning, I realize I need to do two things very aggressively. Three things very aggressively. Number one is get your wide receivers tight ends in there aggressively. 5 to 6 of your players are that, with the other one possibly being a defense. Your captains have got to be such. There's no way I'm going to have a defense as a captain. There's going to be enough people that are going to do that as it is anyway. The next one after that is realizing that the tight ends are pretty strong. When we look at this here, 10 times they have placed and twice they have won. Greg Kittle is probably the best guy on the board, and then Eric Ebron is the next best. And the other two tight ends are definitely worth playing as well. And I think about who I'm playing against, the field, the people. Are they going to make the mistake in playing running backs, in playing quarterbacks? And they're expensive to buy. They're really, really expensive. They're not priced cheaply because of the situation. So I'm going to be curious to see how they do it. I'm going to have 21 different lineups, but I'm not going to be risking that much. It's going to barely be in double digits of dollar terms. But I'm going to play 21 different lineups, 20 lineups in a small game and one lineup in a larger game. And for different situations of such, yes, I'll take a few thousand off the cap here and there. And also realize that put in lower end tight ends as one of your flex plays. I don't even need to do so. I can probably have a lineup of close to my 50,000. But if you're not going to play 3 tight ends, which I am, I might put 3 tight ends in there. I don't think anyone's going to have that exact lineup with, say, maybe Ebron or Kittle as my captain. And then 2 more tight ends. And another thing of worth noting that I find very interesting as well, there's been a couple times where conference championship losers do well in the next game. But players like Tyreek Hill, Alvin Kamara, on the losers' end of the last week, I'm really not too enthusiastic that they're going to be really pumped for having a big game on this, where everybody else, even the players that lost in the first 2 rounds of the playoffs, there's been enough time that has surpassed where they're just going to want to have fun and just really play the game like a kid when I remember playing as a 14 and 10-year-old, where you just want to just play the best you can in an exhibition game format, because it is an exhibition game as it comes down to it. And I think there's going to be enough mistakes in people playing kickers as captains. Well, maybe not that. But playing quarterbacks, and then quarterbacks and running backs as captains as well. For me, the safe thing is just put in 6 different receivers and tight ends. 2 tight ends and 4 receivers. And then that's your safe play. And then just put whichever combination that you can, and try to get as many cashes as you possibly can that way as well. But that to me is the interesting strategy, because I see that with the second one on the bottom, the rake is very high, still profitable long term, because you have to find enough in how you play this to have an edge to defeat the large rake. And by realizing there's going to be a decent amount of people, I will predict, that are going to pick those running backs and quarterbacks, I find it to be a profitable play. I will give statistics on Monday, maybe even Sunday night, for how I ended up doing, but more importantly, how the game was. What percentage of players were picked as captains? And I'm very curious to see how much the quarterbacks and running backs will be chosen. And again, my favorite play is Greg Kittle. I think he is the hands down favorite to have the best game out of everybody. Have yourself a great day. Bye-bye.